Benton.
Witten, happy Friday.
Happy Friday, mate. How are you, my friend?
Mate, I'm limitless. I'm about to disappear off to the Cook Islands. So next Wine and Wisdom, I reckon we should do it. We'll do it from the Cook Islands if the internet allows us to. A couple of weeks off to kite surf.
When are you going? I'm coming. This is my day back. I've been off for a week, and you're about to rack off.
Mate, I am. It's look how much grey's here, mate. That's literally only just come up in the last couple of months. That's so, mate. I'll be over in the Cook Islands, enjoying some kite surfing with Chris Sal and the team from Kite Republic, who were actually on Wealth, Wine and Wisdom once.
They were once upon a time, weren't they?
They were.
Shout out to those guys. Well, a bit of a shout out to a few of the crew logging in right now. We've got Jeff already on. So, Jeff, how are you, mate? Oh, well, people been looking for me, and yeah, I'm here, Jeff. I was going to come back to work on Thursday, but then decided to extend my holiday. So I got convinced by Andy to come back and drink wine because we've got a very special guest on tonight, folks. So make sure you hang around for this one. You're going to love it. Bit of a shout out from Aaron. How are you, mate? Alison, good to see you. Let us know where you're dialing in from, folks. Give us a shout out. Trace is in the house as well. On time. Oh, there you go.
Oh, there you go.
Jeez,
yeah. Well, I think we might be guilty of destroying productivity of some workforces, Jace.
Well, it is 5 o'clock, so 5 o'clock on a Friday. It's time for a glass of wine, Andy. So why don't we do the old, the obligatory intros, folks? Good morning. Good evening. Not good morning. Usually I'm doing my wealth coffee chats, but today it's Wealth, Wine and Wisdom, and we've got a few people bob in from Wollongong, and we've got Sanchito. Mate, great to have you here, and Rodney's on as well. So great to have you all here, folks. And we got Bryce dialing in from YouTube.
Yep. Yeah, love it.
Good to see. So, mate, folks, if you're new to the show, most of you know us, but if you're new, Andy and I kicked this off when COVID kicked off. Actually, our guest tonight's going to be was one of our first guests, actually. I think he was our first guest for Wine and Wisdom a little while ago, but we kicked it off because of the COVID confusion out there, folks, when it came to the world of property investors and business owners and those in the share market. And myself and Andy have been in our respective industries for well over 20 years each and counting. And along the way, we've learned a few things. And these days we enjoy a glass of wine and sharing a little bit of that education, the School of Hard Knocks, the way we've learned with you folks out there, my world of property investors, Andy's world of business owners, and those in the stock market, share market, finance, those sorts of things. So welcome along. Hope you're all awesome and well. And, enjoy the show tonight. There is a little bit of a rough, Andy, there's a small rough, outline.
Yep. Well, there's a description for it anyway. We'll see whether we can follow it tonight.
We try and stick to it. But, we might take a moment or two to just quickly cover some things in the news, only briefly. But I think we'll spend most of our time tonight chatting to our guest because we were chatting off air, and there's some awesome stuff that I think a lot of people need to know what's going on when it comes to the back end of COVID. Now things getting back to normal, and certainly business owners and investors need to be aware of these things. So if you do have some questions, ladies and gents, make sure you put them in the chat. And when we introduce our guest in about 5 minutes, I'm sure I'll have some questions for him as well. So keeping you in suspense. We haven't given away the name yet. But hey, why don't we do this, Andy? Why don't we let's give away a bottle of wine if someone can remember our first guest ever, what his name was. On Wealth, Wine and Wisdom. We'll give away a bottle of wine, folks. Anyone remember who our first guest was?
That's a cracker. But there's a great possibility that if his name gets thrown out there, mate, we may never live it down.
Well, and you're not allowed to go back and look at YouTube and find out who it was either.
But I think we're safe there. There's about 200 and something episodes now. It'd be hard to get that one.
There you go. I guess it's saying, can he participate? Well, I don't think that would be. Well, the wine's pretty good, actually. The only wine I've got is good stuff to give away. So maybe it is worth getting involved.
Well, that's open for the next little bit. And Deanne does actually have our previous winner, so we do need to get that out as well. So
yes.
So yeah, if you can remember who our first guest is, have a guess. He's an absolute beast and on the button, and it's got a great story to tell. Actually, it's a great story about an Irish Australian operating in New Zealand, and but we might see if we can pull a few stories out from him when he comes back on. But
we shall see. Well, mate, yeah, let's get into it. We've got a heap of people on already now, which is awesome. And John O'Rowley, there he is. Rowley was one of our guests, that is for sure, but he wasn't the first. Someone said Heather. Heather was one of our guests, but she wasn't the first. Yeah, but there you go. Well, I hope you guys are able to track that down. But listen, why don't I just tee off just quickly, Andy, a little bit about what's in the news. This might sort of tee us up for our conversation and, get things rolling along. But the big news out there right now, Andy, is Jono. He's always competitive, Jono, isn't he? Hey?
Whack his comment up on the screen. We've got to show that one. Jeez, I tell you what.
He's saying he wasn't the first, but the best. Well, that's debatable, but he carried the team. Jono, thanks, Jono.
Jono's got good shoulders. He's got very, very good shoulders.
He does, and you carried them well, Jono. You did bring the A game that time. We'll have to get you back on too, brother. That would be awesome. But mate, listen,
big shoulders but tiny calves. But sorry.
We're not playing golf now, Andy. But, the big news out there right now is, it was one of the first things that came out as a comment from our guest tonight as well, just randomly. But, the world of jobs, jobless rates, employment, at 48-year lows, folks. And across the nation, that's a good thing for people to have jobs. The challenge is, productivity and production around the country is starting to splutter and struggle. And, a few things are, being a bit of a challenge. I've also got a bit of a question for many. Actually, I think I've given away the answer. I was going to say, which state has got the lowest unemployment rate? Lowest unemployment rate in Australia right now. The average unemployment rate, or the nationwide, is 3.4%. And technically right now, folks, there are more jobs than there are people unemployed. That's the technical thing.
Oh, Jeff's kicked off already with WA.
WA is kicking off. We're speaking to our guest. He is from WA, so that giving a little bit away as well about the jobs teeing off over there in the world of mining. But however, folks, at the moment, according to this article that I read, that Victoria, nation leading employment rate or unemployment rate of 3.2%. So there you go, folks. At the end of the day, what happens with jobs is certainly in my world when it comes to employment and lending and property. When people have got jobs and they've got income, you can lend them money and they can buy property. I think it's a good thing for real estate. It's going to tee off pretty nicely. It is one of the reasons, or one of the main reasons, Andy, I believe that we're already underway, folks. Here's my call. You guys know I make these calls often. So does Andy.
Let's lock it in. All right.
Lock it in, Eddie. Lock it in.
5/18, 19th of August.
We've started the next cycle, the next growth cycle in the real estate game. And why am I saying that? Well, a few things, and I've been talking about them for a little while. but we're already teeing off. We're already seeing the conversation kick off with this stuff, Andy, the idea of migration. We've got a jobs summit coming up. Now, if you look at this, folks, and this is sorely needed, this is an absolute emergency. We need people in the country. Now, at one point, our highest permanent migration intake, was 210,000 people or thereabouts. Check this out. Skilled migration, highest in the past, give or take 120,000 people. The government is talking about lifting the cap. Already they talked and locked in 160. They're now talking 200,000, and that would be 200,000 skilled, not permanent. So there would be other migration on top of that, folks, coming into this country. If the government can get its finger out of its behind, the challenge is it's all good and well to set these numbers, Andy. The next thing is actually to deliver on them. But, folks, if they even get close to these numbers, I'm telling you, we are all ready. There's commitments in play. Interest rates are going to go down mid-2023. They're going to peak by the end of this year. Interest rates will come off a smidgen partway through next year, and that will be the catalyst. People entering the country, the interest rate going down. We'll already be at lowest vacancy rates we have ever seen in Australia. It's already here. Most of our cities are under 1% in vacancy rate. Even in the apartment space, it's under 1% in vacancy rate. Now, a balanced market is 3%. That's a balanced market. Under 1% is insane. There's no stock. There's no property being constructed. There's some challenges. Even Dermot. Oh, I gave it away. Our guest
we go, but the wine might even. Jason, you won the bottle of wine.
Hey, I won the bottle of wine. Well, there you go. Dermot will talk about that potentially later on, because some of the construction companies around the country are in challenging times. So my call, Andy, is we are off already to our next beginning of the cycle. It's locking in. It's loading. And here's the decrease in listings year on year. All right. Decrease in listings. Check this out.
So just walk us through this. When you say decrease in listing, you're saying the
decrease in rental listings.
In rental listings. All right. Okay. So not sales, but rental listings. Yep.
Check this out. Like, how can you decrease already lowest supply, 40%? 40% here in Sydney. Decreased year on year. So that's a year decrease. Check out the other couple of places. You're talking Brisbane, 30% decreases. And Perth kicking in. I think if Perth can get its skates on when it comes to some jobs and some people over there. But if you guys go back and have a look at this, just quickly, WA has got more jobs available than people who live there. And our call is that we might have a little run in the real estate market over there if things work out okay. We're sniffing around. We're looking at some deals in WA for the first time in many years. So, Andy, that's what's in the news for me. Plenty going on when it comes to the pressures building up. Well, certainly people still sitting on their hands, though, Andy. You know what I mean? When it comes to, the world of property and borrowing, because interest rates are up, and a prudent person wants to make sure that their costs aren't going to blow up. But right now, I think we're getting ready for another little run. What do you got on your neck of the woods, Andy? You got anything in the news? And then we'll get our guest on, I reckon.
Mate, well, I'll jump through mine reasonably quickly, because this is something which we called a little bit earlier. So this is interesting, mate. This is, it's interesting. It's not important. It's just interesting. So the Reserve Bank has announced it'll throw its doors open to a panel of private sector economists twice a year in a bid to increase transparency. Now, remember, we said that Lowe is going to have a fair crack. Like he's going to go, listen, because effectively, for those of you who haven't seen what Jason and I have been talking about recently, it's the government have come out and gone, oh, it's the RBA's fault that the economy's fucked, basically, and so they're launching a royal inquiry, and Lowe is quite a tactical kind of a bloke. So he's been more outspoken in the last sort of couple of months than he has probably in the last 4 years. I'm not even sure he's been chair that long, but Jace, I got a sneak peek. So effectively what's going to happen is they're going to have independent economists come in and view what's going on with the Reserve Bank and how they're making these policy decisions.
And maybe we should put our hand up. Maybe we should chuck our hat in the ring for that one.
Right, let's do it. Well, apparently you have to be an economist. And I think that, Jace, you've got way too many calls right to fit the bill of an economist.
I don't get things wrong enough.
But I did get a sneak peek on the first chaired meeting, and so, mate, this is a scoop for Wealth, Wine and Wisdom. I did get a scoop on the first lot of economists that are actually going to be present. Let me just sling that down. No, it's going to be a thorough affair. I'm not quite sure whether they're going to get the charts the right way up or not, but Jesus. How do you throw a country into even worse affairs? You just throw a whole lot of economists in a room together with Lowe from the Reserve Bank to argue over. Ladies and gents, they have monetary control. So effectively, they set the cash rate to kind of control the country, but they have a mandate that's pretty basic. It's mostly inflation, a couple of other things that's sitting behind it. So anyway, mate, I think it's just the political argy-bargy is classic.
Yes,
I thought I'll just bring this up and maybe we'll chat about this a little bit.
Zoom in a little on it, Andy, maybe if you can.
In coming weeks.
Yep.
And I'll bring down here because you and I, we love Japan, right? So this is some stuff from Schroeder, some data that I've been looking at more recently. And on the left-hand side here, it's the expected return over the next 3 years. And down the bottom here is the probability of loss. Right. So ultimately, you really don't want to be getting too much involved in the Japanese government bonds in and around now. They're on the wrong side of it. But in the equities market, and I think we'll chat about this a little bit next week, our actual market as far as Japanese equities are concerned, emerging market equities, Australian equities, and I reckon we'll have a good chat about this next week, are the front runners. But for you, Jason, mate, I think we need that study tour over to Japan. And,
it's on.
Many of our devotees on, and we can take a whole lot of you over to Japan with us, and we can do a bit of a study tour. But mate, these are the returns by asset class across the world. I thought this is an interesting statistic that I got from Morningstar, or an interesting graph. Basically, right across the world, and this is 10-year trailing returns, right? Almost everything positive. Global asset classes year to date, mates, there's almost no one, just the United Kingdom that's actually kicked up. Now, to me, these are really positive things. And it goes a little bit to what you were talking about. And again, I think we're going to jump into this a little bit more next week. But when everything's red, mates, you want to start to pay attention because it tends to go the opposite way reasonably quickly. Not all of them, but mate, my eyes are on the markets. And there's another thing for all of the interest rate junkies out there, whether it be because you've got a mortgage or because you're a retiree and you're now wanting to try and get interest rates locked in for investment purposes or mortgage purposes. So as we know from an investment perspective, Jason, we've talked about this ad nauseum, when interest rates go up, the price of bonds decrease. So if you're invested in bonds and interest rates go up, which is what's happening now, and again, we'll chat about this a little bit more next week, but if you're in a conservative portfolio, and this is really bizarre right now, if you have a conservative portfolio, balanced or more defensive in your super fund, then it's underperformed quite drastically its counterparts in the growth area. Now, you would think that makes sense in a bull market where everything's going positive, but in a market that's going sort of sideways and down and lots of volatility, you would think that a more conservative fund would perform better, wouldn't you? But because of this dynamic, because all of the conservative investments in the portfolio are actually losing value, which means capital value, then our balance funds and our conservative funds are actually in quite negative positions because of these interest rate rises. But there's good news. And you and I have been educating people on the 10-year government bonds and what all of this means. And also to kind of chime in with some of the stuff that you were talking about earlier in regards to property. We saw the peak of the 10-year bond curve, and that was in June 20. Right. And that was just above 4%. And it seems to be stabilizing quite well now in and around that sort of just above 3%, which is what we've been talking about for a little while. And if you look at 5-year and also 2-year, it's telling a similar sort of story.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to be looking at for a little while into the future, what the markets are looking at the moment is really what's happening over here. And whether this stabilizes, because if this stabilizes, Jace, then your sort of call about, the next round, could be a little bit truer than or than you think, because one of the philosophies that you and I have when it comes to investment markets is that the flow of information, the flow of funds actually increases the speed of which things correct and the speed of which things fall and rise, right? Which means that, yes, the GFC, it took 2 or 3 years to recover from. COVID took 3 months to recover from. So it's quite possible that our cycles are now becoming a hell of a lot shorter because of the information that's available to people in the market, because they can go out there and spend their money faster and feel like they're more informed, which means that our cycles actually decrease. The interesting part about COVID, obviously, is that supply chains don't actually mobilize as fast as information does. So,
well, mate, you could be known for a quote on that. You should do a quote card. At the end of the day, information moves faster than your supply chain. But if you can get ahead of those changes, makes a lot of sense.
And so, when we think about this, and this is maybe a good time to bring Dermot in, because when we also think about the flow-on effects of COVID and what's been happening, is we heard about these zombie companies that were getting propped up by stimulus packages. We heard that the magistrates' court wasn't seeing cases. Companies weren't going bust because there was no one to actually hold them to account. But now the ATO wants to get paid, and now the government, are looking out for their payday, and so some of that. Supply chains aren't the only thing that has been held up.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some really interesting conversation that we can have with Dermot in regards to what is going to be potentially a little bit of a tidal wave that's going to be coming through over the next 12 to 24 months that we should all be aware of.
Well, you can only kick the can down the road so far. At some point you've got to pay the piper. So Andy, why don't you do the intros and let's do it. Let's get Dermot in here. Give him the razzle dazzle, mate, before I turn him into bring him into the show.
Well, the only problem is I'm probably going to butcher where he was a partner, and hopefully we're not going to get sued by. I'm pretty sure it's Deloitte, but Dermot is a business owner. He's an entrepreneur. He owns a liquidation business or an administration business that helps business owners wind up when they've made a few mistakes, helps them survive. And then sometimes, it has to help them go on to their next venture. It's a very interesting part of the world. It's not just limited to that. He also has a high-end brand, which Jason and I clearly we don't subscribe to. But Dermot is much more stylish than what we are, and he has a very, very high-end.
I'll have to get some tips from him.
Yeah, we definitely need them. And also a hedge fund manager now as well. And he's a bit of a freak when it comes to all things business. He's helped both of us wrap our heads around some reasonably complex issues and helped many of our clients and also listeners over COVID kind of look and understand as business owners what we need to be looking at. And some of the things he's going to cover off on today are going to be for every single business owner. If you're a business owner and you're listening right now, you do not want to switch off the channel. If you're a CEO or a board of director, if you have director of anything in your name, like, you do not want to switch off this show right about now, because it could be a bit of a horror show, but geez, I tell you what, it may well save your bacon moving forward, mate. So mate, let's get Dermot in.
There you go. Our inaugural guest, our first guest ever.
Thank you, guys. I have to say, I'm glad I didn't know back then that I was your first. I would have been nervous. There would have been some anxiety.
Well, I think we're over 100 shows in now, I think, or maybe over 120 or shows in anyway. So we're getting used to it, but we're loving having you back, mate. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you very much.
All the way from WA. And listen, we were chatting off air, Dermot. So for those listening in right now, make sure you get out a pen and a piece of paper, or take some notes on your iPad or your iPhone, because some of these things that Dermot helps business owners in. And it was also you were talking about self-managed super funds and investors and those sorts of things as well. So, mate, why don't you do the 30 seconds on top of what Andy sort of said intro, and then we'll dive into a few things, because you said the ATO is a bit on the warpath. They're over COVID and they want to get their money.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for the introduction, Andy. You were very generous. I've been doing this for about 25 years in the formal insolvency and restructuring space in Australia. I was a partner at Deloitte for a number of years, and then I set up my own practice, and I was also a partner of Ferrier Hodgson before it merged with KPMG. The COVID was an interesting time for insolvency, of course. We genuinely thought when COVID was starting that this was going to be the busiest that we had ever seen in our entire lives. And that wasn't necessarily exciting. We were looking at it saying we don't have the capacity to do this. And I mean we as in the population of liquidators in Australia. There simply wasn't anywhere near enough of us. But then the government response kicked in, and they effectively turned off liquidation for 12 months. It was that
put everything on the sort of the go slow.
You literally went on a holiday, didn't you, Dermot? Like you literally, in the middle of the biggest business interruption event that we've seen in the last 100 years, you went on holiday.
None of us anticipated that government policy could turn off our businesses the way that it did. But anyway, we broke through that, and that's fine. But one thing that lingered from COVID and the reaction was there was this moratorium with the tax office that they weren't enforcing old debt, and that stretched all the way through until earlier this year. And then, of course, we had the federal election that was looming, and there was an obvious political football there that the ATO didn't want to start moving on small business for the old debt whilst there was this election coming up. So they waited until it was finished, and then predictably they start issuing notices to company directors. Now, you mentioned earlier that they want to be paid. I actually don't think that's right. I think they understand they're not going to be paid, but they're cleaning up the balance sheet. They're not going to let that old debt just sit there. And you also have to remember that the tax office doesn't have authority to compromise what they call crown debt. So if you owe the taxman tax as distinct from penalties and interest, if you owe them tax, that tax either has to be paid or the entity that owes it has to go through a bankruptcy or a liquidation or some form of formal restructure. They're not allowed to negotiate away underlying tax debt. And so that's what they're doing. They're looking at this and they're saying, this is enormous. We haven't seen this probably in the history of the ATO. And they're looking at that default book to get it down. And that's the zombie companies you mentioned. And so the way they react to that is they send out what we call director penalty notices. And these are these really nasty things which try and attach personal liability to the directors of a company for either the GST, PAYG, or super that is unpaid. And what's most frustrating from our perspective is, and we have to explain this, we see the sad circumstances time and time again. What becomes the defining factor of whether or not personal liability attaches to the directors is whether or not they lodge the forms on time. It has nothing to do with the payment. And most directors don't understand the nuance there. A lot of directors put their head in the sand, and when they can't pay the liability, they don't lodge it for the fear that that will get the monkey on their back. So, that's frustrating because we get presented with a business which is potentially salvageable, but now the directors are on the hook personally for all this tax debt. And that, of course, changes the decision making at the director level.
Yeah.
And then that becomes problematic. Directors in that situation don't make rational, logical decisions that you're advising them to. And it's understandable. But that's what they're doing now. And it has having this huge effect on the East Coast. The number of liquidations or insolvency appointments in general has skyrocketed on the East Coast. The West
and you reckon, Dermot, you reckon that's because this moratorium, it's just been building up. It's sort of slowly but steadily sort of, know.
Well, it's a combination of a few things. That is probably the biggest moving part in this equation. The other moving part is the interest rates and the supply chain issues.
Yeah.
And when I say supply chain issues, it's not just goods, but also being able to lock down the right staff to deliver the service. I'm not sure what it's like on the ground in the East Coast at the minute. I'm in WA, but I can tell you here, take, for example, restaurants, they're opening on rotation effectively and when they do open, sometimes they're closing off half the restaurant because they don't have the staff.
Yeah.
So you get this, it almost feels like a wartime response to what we're going through. I don't think it's going to get better in the next 2 months. I think it is aggravated by the COVID wave we have at the minute, but I don't see any quick fix solution to this.
Well, I mean, and Andy and I mean, yourself, Dermot, we run businesses and, we tried to get back to normal at the beginning of the year and, get together and do some travel. And then, half the team have got COVID or they're out or they're sick. And, it really just hasn't stopped. And, I think that's going to continue for quite a while. And certainly the same on the East Coast. It's, I don't think it's as bad right now. Maybe Andy got a little bit different down in Melbourne because it got really knocked for six. But, up here in Brisbane and the Gold Coast, it's fairly okay, but still understaffed and shortages sort of everywhere. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, we're finding that a lot of the owners of businesses are working in them more now, almost right across the board. Because ultimately, especially in the restaurants, if you price correctly, and our clients and our listeners will price correctly because they've spent time listening to us and they know that they've got to raise prices, but that's just what you need to be doing right now. You have to, in order to be able to compete with rising costs of goods, whether that be seafood, whether it be raw materials. You've got a competitive marketplace. You've got higher turnover typically, so you've got higher recruitment costs. So the cost of business is skyrocketing for so many different reasons, which has to be passed on to the end consumer. And I think that a lot of business owners don't actually know that. And I think that that's possibly somewhere, Dermot, that's going to be a problem that's going to exacerbate things moving forward. Because if business owners start to get that fear of desperation where they're clinging on, it's hard to raise prices when you feel like you're losing your business, because even though that may well be the one thing that you really absolutely need to do. Yeah,
it's a nasty problem because, of course, if you miss there's an opportunity right now to raise prices because everyone's perception is that inflation is running. And I don't think any of us accept that 6.8% is a real number. The likelihood that we're sitting at about 50% of the UK inflation rate is pretty low. If the US and the UK are running in double digits, it's highly likely that we will, if we're not there yet, we will get there. Sorry, that's my opinion. What's priced into the market at the minute is that inflation will top out at between 7 and 8%. And we see that as quite optimistic. And you look at the point you just made, Andy, and that is the opportunity to pass costs through. If you miss that opportunity today,
gone.
Customers may not like it, but they're calibrated to expect it. You miss that opportunity today, and then it's going to be rammed down your throat in 12 months' time, and then the uplift is going to be problematic because the uplift then for you to correct could be 25%, and that's going to damage your business in a whole new way. So that there's an opportunity today, but also you've got to run with that tide, or else it will leave you high and dry.
Well, let's reverse up just for a second and Dermot sort of, maybe just put in perspective, the world of liquidator or administrator, or those words often strike a bit of fear, or misunderstanding or terror into many business owners. Many years ago, it was actually the GFC. I don't know if I remember telling you the story or not. I certainly had a few businesses, development businesses, property businesses at that point in time get stung in the GFC. And for me, certainly the right person on your side when it comes to restructuring your affairs. If something hasn't gone your way, liquidator, administrator, whatever the term is, or the right conversation is absolutely essential. Mate, if there's any business owners sitting here listening, or even maybe, let's say, regular people who have some challenges, issues, let's start at the ATO level and work our way back. What would your suggestion be of how to manage this stuff, navigate it? If there's challenges, issues on the horizon, what should people do?
Well, the first thing is they've got to confront the issue, and these are difficult issues. For me, a company going into liquidation means that it's Friday. For most people, this is the biggest decision of their financial lives.
Yeah,
and it's easy for us to forget that it carries that kind of momentum.
Huge.
But you've got to confront the issue. You have a window of opportunity today. I don't mean today, but within the next 12 months. The ATO is not leaving you with a choice. They are presenting you with a conundrum that says either you deal with this old debt or we will deal with it for you.
Yep.
That's rule number one. You cannot allow the ATO to deal with it for you. What that means is they will apply to the Supreme Court and they will wind up the company, and then they will come after you personally for the tax. And that is
that when they appoint someone? So they appoint an unfriendly liquidator, or
they don't have the authority to appoint. All they can do is apply to court and ask the court to appoint someone. But they will absolutely go down that strategy, and they will issue these penalty notices against you personally.
Yes.
So you've got to confront the issue as best you can, and that means getting a liquidator around your table, getting the right liquidator as well. Some liquidators align themselves with the ATO, and they feel that their job on this planet is to be the ATO's henchman. And that's fine. That's where they get a lot of their work from. But most of the situations that we see, are situations where people haven't gone out to rack up tax debt deliberately and not pay it.
Yeah.
So, I say most because even I have had a situation where I encountered someone who deliberately racked up tax debt and didn't pay it, and we had to take proceedings against them, and the ATO funded us. So we work with the ATO when we need to. But 99% of the time, even more, this is just businesses that something has gone wrong. And in today's market, the supply chain goes wrong. The interest rate has moved on you. You can't get the staff, whatever it may be, or you're just emerging from COVID and that has destroyed half of your business. The ATO understand this. So I don't think they're out looking to get their money back. I think they're out trying to clean up this balance sheet. And this is the opportunity to go to them with a plan and say, I want to restructure. I want to deal with this debt. And that, let's be frank, what that means. That means extinguishing the debt without paying it, or paying a number of cents on the dollar. And that's what the formal insolvency regime gives you the opportunity to do. And in today's world, it's difficult to see the ATO looking at a company. If it's what's important here is if it's the first time a company has tried to restructure. Where the ATO seems to get some red lights on things is if it's your second or third time through the wash on that. Yeah. But if it's your first time of having difficulties with the ATO like that, now's the time to confront that. And you can do it in a number of ways, depending on the size of your business. If you've got a small business, then you need to keep the transaction simple and straightforward, because if you don't, then the professional fees can just crush it. So you've got to keep it straightforward if it's a small business. If it's a big business, then, of course, it opens you up to more complex possibilities. But let's assume that it's a relatively small business. There's the opportunity to either go into administration and do a deed of company arrangement that eliminates the tax debt, or go into liquidation and just buy the business out. And that's a bit of an issue, because some people hear that advice and they then go and do the wrong thing. They go and do what we call a phoenix, which is where they just lift the business out and don't pay for it and leave the creditors in the company. And that's what there's now 2 or 3 pieces of legislation that criminalize that activity. Yep. That's what a phoenix is. We're not talking about phoenixes. We're talking about proper restructuring. And one mechanism is just to buy the business out of liquidation. And so in today's world, the ATO are going to be receptive to those type of plans. They're not there demanding their money. They're there demanding that the issue be dealt with.
And really, at the end of the day,
their best interest, if we put in our revenue cap, is for you to be sustainable, right? Because if you're sustainable, if your business exists for another 10 years, well, that's another 10 years worth of employee tax, GST, and all of the relevant taxes that they're going to get back. Otherwise, they're going to get zero back unless they go you personally. Yeah. So ultimately, it's in the best interest of everybody. But I think, Dermot, one of the things is, and I get a bit jaded as well if I haven't spoken to you for a while and it's been too long, because you talk about this with so much knowledge and experience that I start to feel comfortable that I stop going, oh, the ATO is trying to get their money back and all of these sorts of things that boil up in the background. But when you go to your average advisor out there, whether it be financial advisor or business advisor or accountant and things like that, I don't think that there's a level of knowledge around this that brings people the security to have this kind of conversation. Because as you said, when their business is on the verge of blowing up, they go and speak to their accountant. There's been a couple of cases that we've sort of talked about more recently where all of a sudden it's doomsday from the accountants who are saying, well, basically the world's over and, brace for impact. Yeah. But on your side of the equation, it's well, hang on, let's apply a methodology to this. Yes. Let's figure out a way that we can trade through this and understand that, even business owners get to mess up at least once and they get a second chance in the draw.
And that's true. And I should also say, just having been through administration once doesn't mean that the next time you go through, the ATO is going to have the sword out for you. The situation I had last year where I had to commence proceedings against a director wasn't simply because he'd been through liquidation twice. It was because he had done the wrong thing on his tax quite badly. So there was a very serious black mark against his name, and we came along and it was black mark number 2. And these were very serious black marks. These were deliberately avoiding tax. So it's not right to say that the ATO is there with swords out. And the difficulty for a tax advisor is they don't get to see on the other side of the fence when we are negotiating with the ATO or going through formal procedures. So it's understandable that a tax advisor thinks that either you pay the tax man or it's all over. That of course is not true. We get to see the other side. And listen, I'll tell you a funny story. I was advising a company, this is probably 10 years ago. I was advising a company here in Western Australia, quite a big company. I won't get into the details of the industry, but they asked me for some help and they said, we've got a tax problem. We need to negotiate a payment plan with the tax office. So we said, okay, let's start to look at the cash flow forecasts. Let's look at the security position. We got to present them with a decent plan. There was probably tax debt of $3 or $4 million here. So it wasn't small. And we package up a proposal and take it to the tax office. And the response from the tax office was, yeah, look, we understand this. We like the proposal you've put forward. We like the advice that they're getting. There's just one problem. This is the 19th payment plan in the last 2 years. And everyone went silent. How do you respond to that? Now, even in that situation, we got the payment plan. They're not there just to crucify people, and these are human beings, and they will listen and they will understand, and they're smart people, and they're perfectly reasonable. Where they become unreasonable is where directors do the wrong thing, and specifically when directors refuse to engage with the issue, that's when they become quite toxic.
Yeah. I think a lot of that comes from not the right advice, Dermot, as well. I think that and you would know better than me, but I would imagine that there is a lot of people who try and play this game a little bit and give the wrong direction, and then wrong conversations take place, and that's where lives are ruined and businesses are destroyed through people who aren't specialists in this field actually kind of throwing their 2 cents in the ring.
Well, that's it, and it's even worse than that. There's what we call pre-insolvency advisors. So these are people who are not registered liquidators, but try and give the advice of a registered liquidator. And what they usually do is they try and sell the Phoenix concept. And, if you think you're in hot water because you've got tax and you can't pay it, trust me, there is a frying pan to the right-hand side, which is reserved for Phoenixes. If you do a Phoenix and the ATO gets a smell of it, when they start... I had one case, it was quite a big case, and I was put up to be a replacement liquidator, which I ultimately didn't get, but the taxman was chasing quite a big figure here in Western Australia, and before the vote where they were going to put up the new liquidator, the senior representative from the tax office pulled me aside and said, look, we're happy for you to be appointed. We are supporting the other guy, but just so you know, Dermot, if you do get appointed, we will support you and we want to fund you to pursue this. And just so you know, we are going to spend like a drunken sailor going after this guy. Now, I didn't know what, I just put my hand up and said, well, that's pleasing to hear. But when they get their teeth into something, if somebody has done the wrong thing, it's the tax office. It's not a commercial organization that makes commercial decisions on how much will we spend versus how much will we collect. It's about what is the right thing to do. And that's different. Small businesses are not geared to defend against that.
No
That's
way.
The brutal truth.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, and this is a loaded question, you don't have to answer it, Dermot. Do you have the same opinion of ASIC?
ASIC, of course, well, they're a bit different. They're the same in a certain way, but ASIC don't have a debt to collect. So ASIC are only concerned with the law. Has there been a breach of the law here? Where they get their teeth into something, it was in the news yesterday, so I'm not speaking out of school, but there was an issue about 10 years ago where a director raised money in one company and then transferred it to another. It was called the Citation Resources and Continental Coal.
Wow.
And there was a director in Western Australia here called Peter Landau, and he was a lawyer from the CBD. And so we raised this money and then basically moved it into another company. And they've spent 10 years prosecuting him. And they announced it, and it was in the West Australian newspaper yesterday that he had pled guilty. That was after 10 years of chasing.
Yeah, wow.
They get their teeth into it.
Well, if they want a list, Dermot, I've got a list of about 15 other people they can go after from back in the 90s, because that was a pretty popular activity back just a little bit pre-GFC. There was a lot of that stuff going on, and
they can be hard to motivate sometimes to get them to see that something serious has happened and that they should do something about it, and that's very often our job. It's to sort of paint the picture for them, and you guys see how bad this is, but. Once they get their teeth into something, again, you've got to forget about this idea of making commercial decisions in litigation. They make a different decision than we would. So they're like the ATO in that regard. But the big opportunity with the ATO is, the opportunity exists today to restructure. You've got the most obvious reason in the world that we're all suffering commercially, which is COVID and the tail end of it, the supply chain issues, the inflation. It's ripe for all creditors to say, the wrong thing has happened here, but this business ought not close because of it, and come out the other side. And if you put your head in the sand and ignore it, look, pardon my French, but what you're going to do is you're going to piss them all off. And at the end of the day, restructuring is an agreement between people. And if you get on the wrong side of them, they're just not going to accept anything you say down the track. You've got to take care of those stakeholders.
And get out there early and communicate, Dermot. I mean, if you're ignoring it, then certainly that's when people would get annoyed because you're not engaging. And
but the issue
when you
of
say restructure, Dermot, like when you say restructure, so just for the layman terms, we've got people listening in. A restructure, what does that technically mean? Basically, I've got some challenges here. I need to renegotiate what my balance, what the balance I owe to people are,
Yeah.
and then I need to trade somewhere else. Like
So
maybe
what it
give us
really
2
means
minutes
is,
on that. Yeah.
yeah. So the most basic form of it is what we call the voluntary administration process. And what it means is you appoint an administrator, someone like me, you appoint them to take over control of the business. They spend a few weeks, usually 5 to 6 weeks, seeing if there is a restructuring proposal possible. And then they compare that to, well, what would a liquidation look like? So if we liquidate the business, sell everything, put it into a pot, and then pay them out in the cascade that's set out in the Corporations Act, what
Yep.
would creditors get? What would the result be? And typically the result is quite poor. And then we compare that to whatever the plan is. And the plan can be anything you can come up with. And very typically, let's talk about the tax office. Very typically, that plan says we're not paying the tax. Because unless the tax man would get a big return in the liquidation, then a deed of company arrangement that gives them zero is fine.
Yeah.
So you're comparing these two alternatives. And then he puts the alternatives to the creditors and they get to vote. And they get to vote based on the value of their debts, but also on the number of creditors. And getting a proposal like that approved is easier than most people would think.
So if someone's owed 100 grand and someone's owed 1,000, are those votes weighted? Are they?
Well, they are. So in order to pass a resolution in an administration, every resolution needs a simple majority of both number and value.
Right.
So if you take a typical vote on a DACA and the employees like it because they get to keep their jobs,
Yep.
some of the creditors may not like it because they don't get paid. And so you get this trade-off between the number vote and the value vote. And then if you've got a majority of both, that's fine. Or if you lose a majority of both, then that determines the resolution. If you've got a majority in number but not value, or the other way around, then the administrator gets a casting vote and he gets to decide.
Right.
So as I say, the benchmark to get these votes approved is lower than most people would probably suspect. And it's quite a powerful mechanism because even if, for example, the tax office come along and they say, we don't like this restructuring plan, we're owed $1 million and this gives us zero, we don't like it. If the vote gets up, then they are bound by the restructuring plan.
Really?
Their debt is extinguished and the company moves on. And so that's a very powerful mechanism when you really think that through. And that's at its core, that's what our legislation provides for. Now, it is more complex than I've just set out. Voluntary administration it's not a cheap process. And if you've got a very small company with $30,000 or $40,000 of tax debt, then the cost of a restructure like that is probably going to be too high.
Yeah.
And there's another way of doing it, and that is to liquidate the company and buy the business out of the liquidation. You've got to be careful in that regard because that's where this Phoenix concept comes up. And as long as you can show that you paid market value, and one of the easy ways of doing that is to buy it from the liquidator, and then you've got an arm's length transaction. But it's a cheaper process, but you got to be careful. There's a few trapdoors in there that could catch you out. For a slightly bigger business, if you've got debts of more than, call it $1 million, then a voluntary administration is a very, very good and very powerful process. And you emerge on the other side with a clean balance sheet. You've compromised all of those debts. You may have given them a number of cents on the dollar. That could have been zero. Frequently, that is the result from deeds of company arrangement.
Yep.
And you move on. So that's the Australian legislation. It was brought in the mid-90s to be our equivalent of, you hear in the movies or in the US, people get Chapter 11 protection.
Yes.
So what they do over there is similar process. They go to court with a restructuring plan and they say, this is what we'd like to do. And that's the equivalent of our deed of company arrangement. And they go to court with that and they say, can you please approve this, Mr. Court? And the court decides whether or not it's a good idea. So this is our equivalent. Only ours is not a court-driven process; it's a creditor-driven process, and they get to make the decision. But it's the same thing, and it's powerful and it achieves the objective. There are flaws with it, but it gets us. It's our mechanism to make it work.
The mechanism, and like you said, I mean, it's great. You know, you hear these crazy things, maybe like that one article in the newspaper. The 99% of business owners or regular people running their businesses and doing their things are trying their best. They're not setting out to, on purpose, deceive and, not do what's right. And, if something goes wrong, it's great that we've got, a mechanism to have some, processes to manage that in, an effective way. So that's awesome.
As I tell people, in all the jobs that we do, even in situations where you've got a company and a director has done the wrong thing in a situation where they knew they were doing the wrong thing, even in that situation, it's not because they were a bad person. They were put into a set of circumstances which were high pressure for them, and they were forced to make a decision where they had an abundance of conflicts of interest because they were on the hook personally for a bunch of stuff. And, you put any of us in that situation and your decision-making will be flawed. I guarantee you.
Yeah.
So we don't judge people in that scenario. We say, okay, we've got to deal with the issues, but it doesn't make them bad people. I reckon in the last 10 years, the number of jobs where I've emerged from the job and I've said to myself, that was actually a bad person. He went out to hurt people deliberately. It's probably only one or two jobs in the last 10, 15 years where I've experienced that. They exist. And the one or two have been, even in the last 5 years, they've been fairly recent. But it doesn't jade me on dealing with directors who have traded insolvently, even if they've taken money out when they shouldn't have. When you understand the motivation behind it, you usually say to yourself, I'm glad I wasn't in that situation because that's a tough decision. But so it's wrong to judge them.
There's an interesting nexus though, and potentially some of the business owners that are watching here are picking up on it, and it almost feels like an incongruency in what you're talking about. And what I mean by that is that there's some. And if we go right back to the beginning of what you'd said, I reckon it'd be great to summarize the 3 to 5 key points that all company directors and business owners need to be aware of so that they don't trigger these hair clauses that then put them personally in the line of sight. Because the reason why I say about the incongruency, because you almost make it sound attractive to go into administration, Dermot. You speak so fondly and well of it, and how reasonable the process is. And I think that's just because you know it backwards, right? And a lot of people are scared of what they don't know. But then there's these really finite details in the legislation that you can't help people if they fall foul of, right? And I think that's potentially what gives them a really bad name.
If there's one takeaway then today, if you're a director of a company and if you've got outstanding tax debt, what you should do over the weekend is you should go and see where that outstanding tax or superannuation, you've got to see where that debt comes from. Go back and look at every single BAS return that has an unpaid element and check when that BAS was lodged. That's the important thing. If it was lodged within a month of its due date, then even though there's tax outstanding and you are liable for that tax personally today, a penalty equal to the amount of tax, as long as the lodgement happened within a month of its due date, the penalty is what we call a non-lockdown penalty. And if the ATO come and lump you with the penalty notice, you will have 21 days to appoint a liquidator and get out of the liability personally. If the tax lodgement was more than a month overdue, then the penalty is a lockdown penalty. And you can't get out of that by appointing a liquidator. Now, what's really important is you got to distinguish those two. It might be $500,000 of tax debt. You got to work out what sits in lockdown penalty, what sits in non-lockdown penalty. And to the extent that you're coming up with a payment plan for the ATO, you want to be paying off the lockdown penalty stuff, because that is the stuff that you're on the hook for personally. So that's something that any director with tax debt should do immediately. And it's akin to looking down your list of creditors and saying, well, who do I owe? Who have I given personal guarantees to? Well, it should be important to you to get those creditors cleared and then negotiate to get out of your guarantees, get the guarantees off the table.
Yeah.
I set up my business 10 years ago. I didn't have an abundance of capital to set it up, but I had one very strict rule when I set it up. I will not give anybody personal guarantees because I saw the effect. The effect is it's all over. I want to put the keys on the table, but I can't because of the guarantees. And now you start to make silly decisions.
Yeah.
And so I said, I'm not giving any personal guarantees. To this day, 10 years later, I have not had a single supply. I haven't had a single lease. And people usually think leases are where you get caught. You have to give personal guarantees. No, you don't. Every single time I've said, sorry, policy is we don't give personal guarantees. And now, and when it came to leases, they said the same thing. Okay, give us an extra month of a bank guarantee. I said, no worries.
Yep. It's amazing, Dermot. I think we've been banging this drum, Jason and I, for a little while, and I think you don't know that this exists until you've been bitten by it, or you're in your circumstances, Dermot, where it's your job to know about it. My most recent experience was with cars. You went and got your mortgage for a company car, your chattel mortgage, and it literally, and people swear black and blue that you can't do it. And they came up and I said, well, there's a personal guarantee. I won't sign it with a personal guarantee. And they literally just went back and they went, oh, well, that's just the way that it is. I said, well, tell them no or no deal. And they literally just came back 20 minutes later, go, I can't believe it, but yeah, you can have it without the personal guarantee.
Yeah.
And it's that simple, but people don't get it. But you were also alluding to earlier on that is there a way of rectifying if you did miss a BAS payment by a period of time, right?
So remember, distinguish the payment from the lodgement.
Sorry, the lodgement was late. Is there a way of cleaning that up?
If the lodgement was more than a month late, then any amount of tax that is still owed from that lodgement is a lockdown penalty. And that, if I were the director, that would become top of the list to get that paid. That now is the only way of discharging that penalty, is to get the underlying tax paid.
So I think, and in business, we don't understand this, right? Because a lot of the time business owners they lodge based on whatever the accountant can do for them. And if it's late or early, they don't really care because there's a bill that's at the end of it. And the sooner the bill comes, that's not nice to have. But basically what you're saying is, regardless of the circumstances, you've always got to lodge your BAS on time. Correct. And make sure that your super's paid on time and BAS is lodged on time. Is that?
Yeah, and then to the extent super is late, then there's this SGC lodgement that is necessary. It's basically a spreadsheet that you have to lodge with the ATO. Most people are not aware of it because you don't have to lodge this if your super is paid on time. But the same rule exists for this lodgement of super, and that catches more people out even. If the message is, go and have a look at the lodgements and see what makes up this tax debt. If there's a big tax debt, don't avoid it because it's not going to go away. And then the other thing is, if the ATO have already come along to you and said, well, here's your penalty notice and you're on the hook, it's a lockdown penalty, you just got to pay. The important thing to understand there is it's a penalty. It is not Crown debt. And I made the point earlier that the ATO isn't allowed to compromise Crown debt. It is allowed to compromise penalties. And we've negotiated with the ATO before, and we've had 70, 80% reductions in penalties simply because the person couldn't pay them. So they're not unreasonable. You can talk to them in those situations. So don't just think, well, I'm liable now for $500,000 personally, so that I may as well keep on rolling the dice in the company and making things worse. That may not be the case.
Yeah. But it's the mindset you get into as well. It's sort of, I'm in this deep, I may as well keep going.
Correct. I'm going to hang for a lamb, I may as well hang for a sheep. And that's what I'm saying.
It should be in the director's rule book, right? They've got self-managed super funds. You have to go through certain amounts of education, but to become a director of a business, there's no real rule book, is there? It's like, here's your constitution, here's your ability to trade, but there's no book that says first two rules of being a director: lodge on time, every time, on time, all the time. Yeah. Super paid on time, every time, or in front. And if you do those two things, and no personal guarantees, and if you do those three things, then you're probably going to decrease the insolvency statistics or the business bankruptcy statistics, because you'll be able to, in some way, if it's a viable business and you've made a few other mistakes for other reasons, you'll be able to trade out in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Well, I think the key thing, Andy, Dermot, is that it quarantines it to the business activity, not flowing into your personal life. And I think that's really the lesson, Dermot, Andy, really takeaway for me is that, we as entrepreneurs, business owners doing something, extraordinary, taking some risks, it can go wrong. It should not, if you do it correctly.
Correct.
It should not flow and blow up everything. There should be some walls, some damn walls around it. Yeah.
But remember what I said earlier about if you ignore them, it gets them on the wrong side. It gets them on the wrong side to such an extent they came up with this legislation just to encourage lodgement. That's the only reason this legislation exists. It's to encourage people to lodge the BAS and the SGC returns.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. But look, the reality is some people will be sitting saying today, well, I've got this tax debt. I don't know when it was incurred. I don't know if it's lockdown or non-lockdown. Go have a look. Go get the BAS out. You can go to your portal and you can see your activity statement, and it'll say when it was lodged and when the effective date was and the period it applied to. Do a quick spreadsheet with the dates, and it'll tell you what was more than a month overdue when it was lodged. And that will give you your breakdown. And lodgement must be front and center of everything.
Get ahead of it. Get ahead of it. Well, I think that's let's we might put a pin in it there, Andy, Dermot, but for this week. But I reckon we could talk for a lot more about this.
Well, I'd love to, and I don't know what your time's like, Dermot. I'm about to go on a little bit of a holiday, but we were talking off air about some of the hedge fund stuff that you're doing, and mate, I'd love to hear about some of the opportunities that come over the other side of things not quite working out. And if you're happy to come back on and chat about those things, mate, we'd love to.
In summary, it's a hedge fund for, we say it's a hedge fund for distressed debt. That's not quite right. Most people think the spectrum of distressed debt ends when a company enters administration, when it technically fails. We operate on the other side of that, or inside of that black hole, where we provide funding for businesses to go through a restructure. So let's say you've appointed an administrator, but he needs $500,000 in order to trade the business through for 2 months to get it out the other side. We provide that funding. We take security on the business, which the administrator can provide. And then we take it out the other side with you, having eliminated all of the problematic debt. So it's quite a specialized hedge fund. It's quite small, because that gives you very high levels of leverage in the transactions. So it's bespoke for that. We deal with all of the major insolvency firms in Australia. That's not to say we will lend to every liquidator in Australia. Our industry has an average and has a below average as well, and we like to operate in the top half. So, but it's a powerful little hedge fund for that. This kind of product has existed for a long time at the top end of town. It's something the Americans do very well. The American insolvency practitioners, which are attorneys, they bring capital to the table quite well. Australians don't. Australian liquidators in general are very, very poor at bringing capital solutions to the table. We can put it together. We can piece it together at the top end of town, but in the middle market or in the SME side, it's very, very hard. And that's what this fund is designed for. So it's powerful. We need more time to explain it in more depth, Andy, but that's the rough thought of it.
I'd love to, because I think that, as an investment vehicle, I mean, we deal with some, very high net worth clients that we bring special deals to from different points in time. And I think that would be of interest, but I think it's also of interest to kind of shape where we think that Australia should go a little bit, because ultimately there's bad names for these types of funds. But the way that I look at it is, a company fails through poor management or poor leadership, right? But sometimes has an incredible product, business, service that sits behind it. It's just the management wasn't done well. or the leadership wasn't done well. It's usually one of those two things, right? And that can either die and never be seen again, or where somebody like yourself comes along with some smart money and kind of goes, well, this thing's a real deal. Like there's got real possibilities if it was just managed right.
Yeah.
And then all of the employees of that business, or some of the employees of that business, the people who create the products, they get to be employed, and potentially we get to see innovations in Australia that die in Australia. And I think one of the reasons that Australia, is where we are is because we don't encourage innovation. And I think that it'd be great to have a conversation about that. We do a lot in the private equity space, which is sort of that next tier, but you're sort of, it's how to, raise from the ashes a great business that was mismanaged, and how you can make money on it on the way through. And I actually think it's a great investment concept.
Some people hear the brief headline of it and they think, oh, is it a vulture fund? And we say, well, no, it's not, because the purpose of a vulture fund is to take a position and then pull things apart and make a return, because the sum of the individual parts are worth more than the sum now. And that's ultimately what a vulture fund tries to do. We are operating beyond the spectrum of failure, first of all. So we're operating with administrators, and the goal is to save the business. That's why we're investing. Now, the returns are high. And so when we talk to our investors, we talk about returns of circa 35% per annum. And that was the return for last year that we just distributed from the fund. But every single one of our clients, after we're fully repaid, think we're fantastic, because we were the only ones ready to take them through and save them in this process.
Yeah.
And whilst we may have charged a lot for the debt, the amount of debt that was compromised in the process as well dwarfed what we charged. So we still like to think we add value in that regard. It is specific to a certain size of company because of the size of the fund. So at the minute, our sweet spot is lens of between sort of 400,000 and 1.5 mil. Above that, and we syndicate with some of our investors. But that sweet spot for small to medium size is where we are today.
Well, I love it. I'd love to dive into that if you're open to talk about some of the ways that it puts together, and maybe even go through a couple of sort of case studies as to how it operates. Because I also think that there's a number of people who listen to this who do have great businesses, great ideas, and might have mismanaged them, and then they can understand that not only is there a way out, which is voluntary administration or small business restructuring, but there's potentially a way out, and also, an equity launch on the opposite side of it as well. So it changes the perspective of administration and liquidation from a very scary thing to, something that is more familiar, which is maybe then, people don't make those poor decisions, and more businesses survive. So I think it'd be great, mate. If
Love to
come back,
mate. Wine at 5 o'clock on a Friday. You had me at wine.
Perfect. Well,
it's 3 o'clock for you, Dermot.
Well, mate, Andy, Dermot, great to have you guys.
Guys, again, I'm going to go and start telling people that I was your first. I'm not going to explain it any more than that. I'm just going to say I was your first.
That's a good way to explain it. That was for sure.
Yeah. All right, guys.
Appreciate you, mate. Thanks for joining us.
Cheers.
And look forward to hanging out again. Thanks, mate. Cheers, Dermot.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
See you, Dermot.
Well, mate, as always, good to hang out with you also. But, that was awesome. Be good to see if we can lock Dermot in for another one sometime soon. Plenty to talk about. And certainly a few comments here saying, great reminder for all directors.
100%.
Bit of a shout out. Yep.
They should teach this stuff at school, Jace. Really, they really should.
Well, mate, I think that's part of your and my calling anyway. Why we do this, we like to make sure that people understand what's going on. And big shout out from Bryce as well. Thanks for everything for everyone tonight. But mate, I'm going to love you and leave you tonight because I've got a new fireplace just outside, and there's pizzas on the ready. So I'm going to say, hey, folks. It's been awesome. Been great fun. But it's a bit of a good night from him.
And it's a good night from me. I'll see you next week in Atataki.
Good night, folks.
Good night, everyone.